Muchas gracias por estar acá. Para efectos de agilizar el proceso de nuestro último workshop, agradecería a los señores panelistas que procedan a ocupar sus lugares en la mesa, digamos, semicircular que tenemos al frente.
Stand that is located in the front.
Estamos Teresita Palacios de Conatel,
Teresita Palacios from Conatel,
Nimbie Ewal de la IFT de
from
México,
IFT of Mexico,
Sergio Escarabino
of the
Verena Weber de la
ITU, Verena Weber, Raúl Katz
de Tele Advisory, Omar de
León,
Tom Oliver de FIDE Partners,
Elena Scaramuzzi,
José Juan Aro de Telefónica,
Cristina García,
Carolina Rossini y Adela Goberna de ALAI. Estando todos presentes, le damos la palabra al señor Pablo Bello,
to Mr. Pablo
que nos va a
Bello,
exponer las telecomunicaciones aliado estratégico para el desarrollo de América Latina.
For the development of Latin America.
Muchas gracias, Marilena. Y tú
Thank
también,
you, Marilena.
Marilena,
And
para acá también.
you please sit down as well.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
La verdad es que más que una
In
presentación,
truth, more than a presentation,
queremos hacer es
we want to
una
have
invitación a una
an
conversación.
invitation to a conversation.
De esta mesa tan amplia,
This sense of
más que
having this
un conjunto de
table,
presentaciones y
apart from the
exposiciones,
group of
es tener
presentations,
una conversación,
is to have a talk,
conversación más abierta,
a more
más
open
informal,
talk,
más
more
light,
informal talk
respecto de cómo abordamos
about how
los
to
desafíos
address
que tenemos, por delante
challenges
en el
we
ámbito
have ahead
de la
in the
conectividad,
context
¿no?
of
Esta
connectivity.
es la última o una de las últimas
It is one of
actividades
the
que
last
tenemos,
activities
acá en la semana, y lo que
of the week,
queríamos era poder
and
tener
what
una
we
suerte
intended was
de
to
resumen, una suerte
summarize
de ideas fuerza que puedan
the
quedar
ideas
sobre la
and the
mesa
powers
para,
that can be left on the
plantear los
table
desafíos que tenemos
for the
por
challenges
delante.
we have
La presentación,
ahead.
en realidad,
The presentation, indeed,
son las ideas fuerzas que
are
hemos
the
venido
ideas that we
conversando y que hemos venido
have been talking about, where companies are able to get a return and the public policies are favorable to achieve that effort. What is the magnitude of that investment? That is something that we have to continue to study. There are estimates, and indeed the efforts required are significant. The central question here, and the one we want to bring to the table, is how we do it. If we want to establish goals for the year 2025, for the year 2030, and close the gaps with the OSD, it's not just with the SDGs, it's not just infrastructure, it's the use. If we want to close that divide, what is it that we need to do? And what can we actually do? Those here, the industry, the academia, the governments, the regulators, the international agencies, what is it that we need to do in order to speed things up? That is the main question, and that is our invite to talk. Without further ado, we would like to have an open, frank discussion, just as this Congress is, to bring to the table the ideas that can help us develop infrastructure in a better way. So I give the floor now to Marilena, who is going to lead this conversation. And once again, it is an open, frank, constructive conversation that we intend to have here. Thank you, Pablo. With Pablo's presentation as a starting point, and in the fourth day of discussions, we can assure that the use of ICTs in the productive systems in the region provides a unique opportunity to move towards development. We will walk this path only if we are able to empower the possibilities to use these opportunities. The evolution is very fast and the time of reaction is very little. We have many challenges ahead, not just from the digital standpoint, but also in this very table. It's not just the background of finding a pragmatic approach
sino también el reto
but
de ser
also
muy
the challenge
concretos
of being
y
concrete and
tiempos
assertive
controlados,
in
de tal forma
controlled
que
times
demos
in such a way that we
a
can
todas
provide
las opciones
opportunities to all the perspectives present on the table.
representantes, como ya
We
dijo
have
Pablo, de múltiples
representatives
actores
of
dentro del
different players
ecosistema,
in the
así que somos
ecosystem, so
privilegiados
we
de
have
tener
the privilege
diferentes
of
enfoques
having different
y
approaches,
de esta
and
forma estamos
this way
seguros
we
se
are
derivan
certain
mejores
that
resultados.
good results will
Vamos a dar un primer set de preguntas
prevail.
la discusión,
There is a first
luego
set of
avanzaremos en el
questions
diálogo,
to encourage
centrándonos
discussion,
en los
and then we will
desafíos
move on to
fundamentales
the
de
dialogue,
conectividad
concentrating
y
in
transformación
connectivity
productiva que
and
nos
productive
permita
transformation,
en
allowing
esta
us
mesa llegar a conclusiones
to reach
específicas que nos
specific
sirvan a
conclusions
todos
that
para
will serve
avanzar
us all to make progress, to
Un
advance.
segundo, me había olvidado de mencionar. Hemos preparado
I
en
forgot to
ACEP
mention
un
that
documento,
we have a
¿no?
document.
Le llamamos manifiesto de nuestra
We
jerga
call it
interna.
internal
Es un
manifesto,
documento justamente donde
and it's
plantea
a
esta visión,
document
¿no?
that
Plantea la
states this vision,
importancia de la
and the importance
conectividad,
of connectivity, the importance
del
of
cierre de la brecha,
closing the gap,
cómo la
and
digitalización es un
how
factor
digitalization
central de
digitalization
desarrollo
is
productivo,
central
y lo que hemos venido
for
haciendo
productive
desde la industria de las
development, and
telecomunicaciones
what we
para
have been
poder
doing in the
avanzar,
industry
y cuáles son los
to
desafíos que tenemos pendientes, y que los
move
invitamos
forward,
a
and
leerlos, y
what
es un
are
poco
still the
también
pending issues to be
parte de la
resolved.
invitación a esta conversación
So
que
I
tiene que ver
invite you
con
to read this document as part of the discussion. Thank you.
Bien, en este momento me permito citar al doctor Katz,
I
en un
would
estudio
quote
desarrollado para
Dr.
que dice
Katz,
que para que la digitalización
and
alcance un
I
impacto
quote, for
significativo en la
digitalization
economía y
to
la
reach
sociedad,
a significant
debe
impact in
alcanzar
economy and
altos niveles
society,
de utilización
must
en
be
individuos,
highly used
empresas y
by
gobiernos.
individuals, companies,
Arrancando por
and
ahí,
governments.
tenemos el primer
That
set
would be the
de
start point.
preguntas.
So we have the
¿Cuáles
first set
son
of
los
questions.
principales retos
What
de
are the
América
main
Latina?
challenges
¿Cómo
in Latin America?
romper con la base
How
actual
to
de los modelos de
break
crecimiento para
how to
abandonar esta
break
dinámica?
away
¿Cómo
from the
podemos
current
construir una referencia
growth
válida a
models?
escala
How can we
regional?
establish a
¿Qué
valid
necesitamos
reference?
profundizar?
What
¿Qué
is it that we
barreras
need to
tenemos y
deepen?
en qué nos
What
movemos?
barriers do we have, and where
Dado
can
que
we move
citamos al señor
forward?
Katz, me permito
And since we
abrir la
mentioned
mesa
Mr. Katz,
pidiéndole al señor Katz
I would like to
su
ask
participación.
Mr. Katz to actually
Gracias,
participate.
Marilena.
Thank you, Marilena.
A mí me parece, yo creo que más o menos lo tenemos
I
claro.
think that we have everything clear somehow. The issue is how
Yo
we
veo
do it.
acá tres barreras.
And I see
o tres
here three main barriers.
Cuanto más me adentro
The
en
more
la
I
situación de
get
los diferentes
into
países,
the situations
una
of
de
the
las
countries,
variables
I realize
que
that
nosotros nos cuesta romper
one of the
es la
variables that are
variable-
difficult to break down
esa es
is
como la
the
variable que explica que un
institutional
país
barrier.
de pronto acelere su desarrollo.
So a country may speed up in this development, and then there might be another country that is stuck.
dos dimensiones.
And there are two dimensions to it:
Político
political leadership
y la
and
multifuncionalidad dentro del aparato.
multifunctionality.
El liderazgo político estaba haciendo, por
Political
ejemplo,
leadership.
en Alemania. Y-
For example, in Germany,
Estaba entrevistando a Lufthansa.
I interviewed Lufthansa, DHL,
Siemens.
Siemens.
Y lo que pasa es que Angela Merkel,
and Angela Merkel.
cada año,
Every
va a
year,
la feria de Hannover,
She goes to the Hanover Fair,
4.0.
and she
Ya
talks
sabemos
about
que ella
Industry
está metida en eso
4.0.
hasta
So she is
nos
very
da la
much
visión
involved.
de dónde
And
queremos
you get the
llevar
vision of where we want to get this
en
industry.
Alemania, en
In
términos de
Germany,
su digitalización
in terms of its digitation as well.
y desgraciadamente eso no lo tenemos
Unfortunately,
todavía.
we don't have that in Latin
Con
America
muy pocas
yet,
excepciones. Quizás
with
el
very
presidente
few
Santos,
exceptions.
en su momento fue muy
Maybe
claro en ese
President
sentido,
Santos was
pero
very
si no,
clear
el
in
liderazgo es muy
his time,
ocasional.
but
En términos
otherwise
del
the
poder
leadership is
ejecutivo,
very
sentarse y decir,
occasional,
esta es la visión que nosotros tenemos
and
para
say,
América.
what, this is the vision for
Segundo,
Latin
la
America.
multifuncionalidad.
Second,
Porque
multifunctionality.
Lo hemos
And,
evocado de alguna manera el día de ayer, creo.
Yesterday, I
Donde
believe we talked about this,
Nosotros estamos convencidos,
We are
pero de
convinced
ahí a resolver
that we need to do this, but
cuestiones
from
de
that
los conflictos
to resolving the questions
o
on the
alinear el
conflicts,
conjunto del aparato del Estado,
underlining
en términos de
the
estos
state
objetivos, ahí hay un
apparatus, there is a big
Hacienda está metido en el tema tributario,
step to be taken.
educación quizás no entiende la
So
importancia
maybe
de
the tax authority
trabajo,
is not
o la
involved,
entiende de una
education
manera
does
muy
not
resumida,
really know how to do it,
desarrollo productivo,
productive
está
development,
pensando en materias
is
primas,
thinking about raw materials,
pesca,
fishing,
cobre,
copper,
la soja, y
soybean,
necesariamente quizás por ahí quizás
and
no
maybe
el
that's
desarrollo
not the way.
Entonces tenemos que alinear.
So we have to provide alliances.
Y ahí hay un trabajo de
there is work to actually convince people and the different instances of the state, and show how this is a facilitator for the future of our societies. So it is an institutional topic. Second, we must have the vision and the agenda. And unfortunately, many of the agendas that currently exist in the region and elsewhere are what I call the agendas that imply that you request, ask the ministries what you think about digitalization, and we put everything together without some special, unique guideline for that. So you don't get back to say that we start from the vision and how you connect. That is not done. Apart from the fact that agendas have 150 goals, and those who study strategy know that strategy means what you are going to do and what you are not going to do. Unfortunately, we have 150 goals and maybe 5 things. When Angela Merkel stands up and says something, she says 2 or 3 things. So the vision and the agenda. And the third element is the participation of companies, and not just the private sector. And I don't mean the telecom only. I talk about the companies working in different industrial sectors. We must bring to the table these companies because they are the ones that will help us convey this point of view. We are convinced already, but we need to join the companies. We need to bring the transportation companies, manufacturing companies, so that we can know why is it so important. And there we have to cross the Rubicon and talking to them and try to find ways to involve them. Once we have a shared agenda, not just with civil society, but also with the productive sector, we will then have a win. Verena will speak to us about the institutional framework.
So I would say the good news is the challenge you just mentioned about institutional frameworks. All other countries are having the same challenge, so it's the same in other countries. It's not only in Latin America. So we're looking at this quite closely in our Going Digital project, and there are a couple of things we see. So far, there is not one best practice, so countries have different approaches. But what is important is to have a holistic vision, to include all the different ministries, and to define a clear lead. So, you know, who is the one who's coordinating, what are the role of the different parties and ministries. So this is really important, and we see that some countries created a unit in a presidential office to coordinate everything. We have other countries that say, well, okay, but this means, you know, it highly depends on elections, you know, every 4 years we'll face that there is a big change. So other countries decide to determine one ministry that is then coordinating the effort of others. I think what we might need to change, like in this sector, is, you know, that we start inviting other ministries. So that we not only focus on the communication ministries or the economy ministries if they deal with ICTs, but, you know, having the transport people at the table, having finance ministers at the table, having education people at the table. So I would say this is important. And second, because for us, like, one of the main challenges of Latin America is the need to increase connectivity. And there we think that it's really important to have strong regulators that base their decisions on evidence. So, you know, that clear market analysis are taken to then, you know, really say, okay, this is the result based on facts and this is where we need to go. And for that, because, you know, the environment is converging, you need different skill sets. So you need very different people within a regulator. And I think there is also a challenge to attract this kind of talent to ensure that we see strong regulators in the region.
Gracias. No es necesario que la palabra pase por mí. Si alguno
It is not necessary that the word comes to me. If anybody wants to speak straight, go right away.
Gracias.
Thank you. I wanted to support what Raul and Verena said, support it and supplement it. If we aim at the governors in Latin America in the short term, will take those decisions. Perhaps we have to wait, not for the people, but because of the institutionality. And I share the need of the streamline, but also we must supplement where we are. And we were talking about inviting companies from other sectors. And luckily, I can say that in this meeting, we brought FAO as a UN organization in charge of agriculture and food. And we also invited World Health World Organization, WHO, but they could not come. And they are already implementing projects of fixed international institutions in the UN family have already projects incorporating TICs to their particular sectors, and they're doing it with the sectors of the company, but also with telecommunication companies. So, again, yes, we can aim at our rulers will enroll themselves in that and will have that vision and coincide to align all the sectors under their command. But we must work from the basis to exchange experiences because they're taking place. They're not really waiting for the telecommunication sector to go there. They're doing it in each of the sectors already. Thank you. Some things, I wanted to concentrate on three things.
No one is alone trying to figure out how to with the digital divide. And I think we learned actually in this past week from all the experiences we've seen that partnerships are a core enabler of connectivity. And we at Facebook, we see partnerships as a core of how we do our business, from partnering with Telefonica in Peru to partner with mobile telcos in Africa or MNOs in Brazil, where I'm from. And thus regulation needs to enable this experimentation. Needs to enable the experimentation that we're seeing here during the CLT and now the CPR from SAS with satellites to the youth clubs here in Cuba, which is an incredible experience. And this regulation should always try to enable this intentional experimentation. We need to have space to experiment, because from this experimentation, you see both women in Africa, and I was in Nairobi some time ago, really developing communities to help each other when they have babies, right, and exchange clothes and support and money, to actually a huge growth of SMBs that we see in our platform, helping with digitalization from Europe to Thailand. And it's not just on the economic growth, economic side that we see this growth, is also actually on the social and cultural growth. So allowing this innovation, you can see innovation through, allow experimentation, you're gonna see innovation and growth in all these aspects of life. This means that regulation needs to be very careful and observing actually what happens in all the countries and in which stage you're gonna interfere, because one form of intervention in one country in Latin America might not be the adequate form in Africa and vice versa. So we need to move carefully and work with data. Raul has provided data, incredible data in a lot of panels during this week. So we need to look at that data and really figure out how to devise specific policies for specific niches and countries depending on their development stage.
Sí, gracias. Yo tengo una preocupación bastante de
I have a concern with this topic, And if we observe what is happening in the world, the main engine that causes all these changes come through the digitalization and the introduction of the Internet of Things and technology that also pushes the development of the infrastructure, especially mobile and wire services. And if we look at the concept of the cell phones, more than a concept, it's a group of technologies that is very much aimed at supporting this type of service with great investments that computing will move together with the network and apply it in critical situations. The network should provide a high quality of service. So we are in a situation that everything is intermingled, and we must protect the network that have been developed for decades and with great effort, and perhaps without this network, we will not have the rest, and there will be a great impact. The subject, the concern is because unless we, with every respect, we're discussing here all these subjects, it's difficult to reach the governments to understand, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, to be able to really explain all this which is happening. It's the future social and economic situation of our country. The U.S. is working strongly in the private sector independently in the development of platform. For instance, in China, even in the world, China and the U.S., because of the size of the countries and economies, have been recognized that they are in better conditions than Germany for the development of platforms, not having to cross borders. And a struggle of power is taking place internationally, the domain of platforms that allow the control of productions in the rest of the country. General Electric is selling their mines for a service, and their platform, they're selling their platform for the development of productive sectors. Meanwhile, we're working on that, and we are in the stage of discussing what we're going to do, and not united. So for me, the most important concern right now is how to impose an emergency sense in all this and have access to the authorities to have nationally a governance structure of all this process, going from the basic of the spectrum down to education, and education for 20 years. In other countries, they're doing this simultaneously, yet we have not done it. So obviously after that, what happens will be to have at the region something similar. Otherwise, we will be left behind. And this is already here. We cannot continue talking about this. It is something which is for this year, for next year, but it cannot be delayed to reach the governments to take that position. A rapid comment on something that in practice the main problem, as identified in the introduction, is a gap of investments, structural. We can speak about several aspects, implementations and so forth, but at the end of the day, if as of now, we have to build up investments that are necessary. There is already a clear process which has to contribute for the great investments that are necessary to establish that goal. So something very important to attract the investments of private people is to have a clear, strong framework, independent regulators that can implement in a clear way, irrespective of the government, politicians, and so forth. Because things change. We see it every day. The governments change. And the important thing is that the country, the infrastructures, should be strong and must continue under any political situation. The important thing is that this institutional framework should be strong to absorb all the waves that reach from the political side, because in each country, in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America, it's something universal. It happens in all those places. So the use of rules of regulation efficiently to allow for an investment, a private investment, and an accuracy for investors at the same time would be a good contribution of the state where the private sector cannot reach. So we have to see where private investments are economically valid or not. We must begin intelligently working. The few resources the states have should be used in the non-economic areas. The basic of any telecommunication is basic, but it is not obvious. There is a lot of confusion, many things, and at the end of the day, we need our priorities and concrete issues that should be made in each country.
Sin nada, bueno, lo primero, muchas gracias. Luego voy a repetir muchas cosas que se han dicho y eso es bueno.
So I will not repeat the things that we have said. We have a higher level of consensus, and Raúl and Verena and others have said with the LSD and other documents. And that, if we have to summarize the results of this Congress, I would say it is the first thing to be highlighted, a concrete proposal of establishing a ministry that at the highest level can coordinate things in the country. The OSD made a concrete recommendation on the matter in Chile. And second, at least to rethink the transformation of regulators. It is an effort that is being done in Colombia, and we were presented to it at the CRC. Second, I get to the idea of Raúl, strategy. We cannot choose too many priorities. We have to find a sequence, establish ourselves clear goals, to do little but do it well, and do it with a sense of urgency. I also stay of the conclusions of some intuitive thing. The main problem that face the companies of telecom is not regulation, it's fiscal. And it supposes that the telecom sector can contribute with 50% more than the rest of the sectors. Is not a good policy, and it's not promoting the development of infrastructure. Elena is saying that most of the investment in Latin America is private investment. Most of it comes from private investment, but it doesn't mean that only private entities should make efforts to finance telecom. The liberation, the release of absurd fiscal burdens affecting the investment is a necessary step for the development of connectivity. I will also keep the Facebook idea. It has been mentioned a great deal. Some agreements with Facebook and Google. And in Telefonica, we think that the way to advance further is including, not excluding, bringing everybody to the table. And this interaction helped discovering other things. We found opportunities with other telecom operators so that we do not invest, we do not duplicate facilities so we can build together as we are doing in countries in the region. So that as we have done with Facebook, they can understand the difficulties they face and the ones we face as well, so that we can understand the challenges we have ahead. And last, the idea of the competence. I think it is a very nice illusion, the idea that all Latin America can agree on how to move forward in the area of digital policies. But that is just an illusion. Reality is that attempting to agree regional policies will slow the process down by definition. So both the two things should be done in unison. You have to discuss and at the same time try to move forward and as quickly as possible. I want to see countries which are championing digitalization. We have the sensation that the feeling that Colombia has been doing a case leader, and maybe has somehow slowed down a little bit and should regain pace. Chile is also a leader, and I have the hope that if any of these countries continues to move forward and the others see success, they will join them. This is the case of Latin America. Just to give an example, Europe, since the year 1957, has been trying to find pan-regional operators for telecommunications, and they have not done it even with a full intervention they have conducted with the telecom single market, digital single market. And so, Latin America, through individual decisions of countries, foster pan-regional countries, América Móvil, Telefónica, Telecom, AT&T. Not always the coordination has been achieved. We believe that probable competition may assist.
Since we have been talking about the institutional framework and about the regulatory models, we have two regulators here on the panel, and I would like to ask you if those present regulatory models are valid. How do we propose some changes on them, and how we do that on time so we can take advantage in those changes? No doubt, this table will coincide that this contributes to the path to development. We are to go deeper into these aspects, and we have to socialize in a way to say all these aspects, and those who are going to use or identify the young persons who are doing this, and we have also to involve top leaders of governments, because the only way we can achieve the government or the decision makers to be involved and take the path to facilitate might be by creation or raising awareness in the government, in the people leading the countries. As a regulator, I repeat once and again, we have to involve all sectors. We said that we were talking about some different things, and we are debating in this telecommunications forum, and we do not involve the Ministry of Industries, the Ministry of Economics, and some other sectors. And we also were saying that health, security, education, which are using the technologies for their development, are also to be involved. Sometimes we do not make this coordinated work with the different sectors, either private or public, and with the regulators. In my country, we have a law And we try to use these rulings to be in agreement with the coming challenges. I totally agree we have to work together with the government and with the regulator. And of course, the regulator have a strong person, so he or she can support the investments to be done.
Sí, gracias.
Yes, thank you. I'm from Mexico. I come from Mexico, from telecommunications from the federal district. And as you know, we are a young organization. We have been created only 5 years ago, and we are a strong regulator. We have a secondary telecommunications and broadcasting law that have been enacted about 4 years ago. And despite that, many times we feel that we are trying to trap technologies. We understand that we have to make decisions about regulating these or those aspects. And I was in the Colombian workshop in the morning, and they were speaking about the need of having a flexible and dynamic regulatory context. It's complicated, but it's also necessary. So they were also speaking about inviting different sectors. Last year, for instance, in the Global Symposium about regulators, we talked a lot about collaborative regulation, and we see that in the framework of the attribution of the National Institute for Telecommunications. There are attributions for that institute that has to do with the regulators, and among the attributions of the institute, it is to take care of privacy of the users. Many of us have been talking in the sense that we have to allocate responsibilities. So we have to create those regulatory frameworks with a dynamic character. And yesterday, or day before yesterday, Mexico endorsed Agreement 108 from the European Council, and that is related to the management of borders issues. And this is an effort fostered by the Information Institute, and we are to analyze as well how this has an impact on us. This is a convergence of all these aspects, and that is a great impact for we all. And we also analyze the topics related to cybersecurity, which is the situation of the Institute, how are we to coordinate with different actors and with different players, and which is going to be our vision and the approach we would like to have. I've said in Facebook, we are to analyze every issue, and up to a certain extent, we are focused on this topic of the CPTs in collaboration with justice because of the situation we have in Mexico. Those are topics, local topics, that we are analyzing. And finally, I would like to finish by mentioning a phrase from Pablo in yesterday's or day before yesterday's presentation. We have to analyze and find a way on how to go from this consumption internet to productivity internet. We are all gathering to analyze that. That's why these encounters are so important. Having together regulators, governmental institutions, companies, and many other bodies, and this is going to be useful for creating this awareness. And something we have to think about in each of these cases, when to regulate and what regulating has to be clear is not only led to protect specific sector. When not to regulate, and this happened in many countries, I think in Thailand, they have a video recently, and when they decided to eliminate the regulation to represent the public interest and the protection to consumer that was identified many decades ago. And I think the taxes issue mentioned by the colleague should be analyzed in this sense. And I had a specific example, which is very close to the things I do and I like to do in Facebook. It's a matter related to gender. The governments might help doing an offer and allowing new networks technologies, but there is also the need to work with public health, with other entities, creating safe spaces for the development of some innovations in certain communities. The Economist has shown an index which is named the Index of Inclusion in the Internet. And it's open, and the data is open as well. And then we can see there that in many countries, the gender gap have been invested. In countries like Brazil, the Philippines, and Namibia, there are more women connected than men. We know that in the World Bank regulations, we can see women who are connected, more women connected. They deal with the economic development of the community, not only with the individual economic development. So there are policies, specific public policies, to contribute with women to be connected in this way. So in Facebook, we can see that, and we are to develop some programs. So some people in Africa with the program Express Wi-Fi are women that have created a small one, and they connect to the internet in any parts. They pay, they do some exchange for using the internet, and we have to think which is the role played by the government, not only in the regulations of the infrastructure, but also in a favorable context for connectivity. I wanted to, for those who are following the debates, I just wanted to retake some aspect that Bruno Ramos brought to the table when he was dealing with a representative from the telephonic companies. And in the International Organization of Telecommunications, we count on all Latin American countries as member states. And when Bruno was saying yesterday, when we talk to each other, we take some risks. And recently, Jose Juan was speaking about Chile and Colombia, who are members of the OSD. In Latin America, we have 3 countries which are members of the OSD, and we need to be careful. And I share what you were saying about the regional harmonization. If we are waiting to make the regional harmonizations of the countries might reach the point where they want to get, it's going to be too slow and it's going to be too late. But we need to make an effort to increase that regional participation and to analyze the countries on an individual basis, to analyze their realities, and to get closer to the speed they can to the better performance and the integration of the digital economy. I have the feeling that perhaps we are trying to have a unique model, and indeed we have different realities. That is not the same to talk to Colombian representatives, of Chilean representatives, of Uruguayan representatives, or representatives from Costa Rica or from Cuba.
I wanted to add something based on the interactions we have had with the different actors in the market. I'm talking investors, operators, regulators. Actually, the importance here is to find a partnership between the private and public sector. After several analyses on the different operators in the region, we have seen that for a healthy investment and transparent climate, business climate, it would help very much if we have investments. In several countries, we are seeing a lot of interest in investment. For wholesale networks, the other issue is regulations. Mexico is a good example in this regard. There are wholesale inputs that are important for transparency purposes and for reducing costs and for competition among competitors and well-established competitors. Ultimately, this will be reflected in the retail market with interconnections, with hard lines. All this will have an impact on the rates, which in turn will improve all these services. So interaction is very important. Finally, I wanted to add that cross-cutting issues among different sectors is very important. Colombia is an example. There, BNP has played a very important role as the leader between not only that sector that is still considered an ICT sector, but to promote or to become a promoter, to bring in other sectors like health and education, using the ICT sector as a leverage for better growth. One of the main problems today in Latin America in comparison to Europe is that we are still trading with raw materials. That is our source of livelihood. This makes us dependent on exogenous factors like oils, currencies, and it is affecting us macroeconomically speaking. So I think it's time to become or to develop a service economy where dependency is much less. I'm reacting to things I've heard today. The question about when should we regulate. I believe that if we want to liberate the necessary capital to build the future networks, the one that we see in the document, I think the most relevant question would be when should we regulate. And I think we will get more value in Latin America if we eliminate once and for all obligations that are absurd, and we can all agree that they are absurd. Obligations of having public phones, to provide phone guides, to have contracts, written contracts in outlets. The efforts that operators can carry out to eliminate the red tape, as Americans say, is worthwhile. The human being throughout history has understood that it's easier to learn than to unlearn. And doing away with things that make no sense is good. Eliminating concessions in Brazil, for example, eliminating restrictions for satellite TV in Argentina, and other examples. Eliminating restrictions and favoring or making possible for capital to invest in any telecommunications sector is very, very relevant. And I think that is a task that we should promote. The other side of the coin is when should we regulate? And here we have to be very clear. As I said, we as Telefónica, we cooperate with other agents in the digital sector, but we are not comfortable in a world where we assume all the responsibilities and other agents don't. And here we have three things we have to reflect on. Obviously, we have an opinion, but I think we have to put this on the table. One thing is some global standards, something that the GSMA does. In the case of Cambridge Analytica, they have been dealing with standards for privacy. If the CRP can be the basis for establishing the standard, the CEO of Facebook and the CEO of Microsoft are the ones who have suggested or have committed themselves publicly to adopt some standards as a rule for privacy in all their global operations, and we believe this is totally valid. A second issue deals with jurisdiction. Everybody knows that privacy regulated by the Privacy Shield between Europe and the United States means that American companies, to protect the privacy rights of European citizens, committed themselves to have some extraterritorial application of the European law, at least for international data transfer. That has never existed with the Latin American countries. And in fact, there have been lots of debates, particularly in Brazil, regarding the implementation of the civil framework law to companies that providing digital services in Brazil are declared that they are not established in Brazil, therefore they do not have to comply with the Brazilian legislation. This applies also to Colombia, to Chile, and we believe as a telephone company established in Latin American countries that it's a little bit strange, to say the least, that you provide services in a country and you believe you are exempted from complying with the laws, the national laws of those countries. And then there is a third issue that deals with international trade and with taxes that has been being discussed in the business earning profitship of the OECD. And we have to understand that when we go to consumption transaction from the physical world to the digital world, this becomes a transaction that becomes an international transaction, and a international consumption transaction requires the origin of the value where the transaction is done to see if the sanctions what sanctions should apply, the U.S. sanctions or the Colombian sanctions or the Chilean sanctions, and this has to be solved. Today there is a debate promoted by the U.S. president that has generated a commercial war regarding the goods and services trade. The United States has decided they are going to correct the deficit by increasing tariffs to certain products and creating a lot of tension. The curious thing here is that the U.S. government that has a protectionist vision in terms of goods and services is promoting in the World Trade Organization and in G20 a flexible vision regarding digital services. I think this is something that we should discuss and we must understand Latin America needs to see or analyze the things seriously. So our first priority should be to regulate. In terms of regulation, we have to understand all these phenomena and the emerging standards related to jurisdiction and international trade and the trade war we are all involved in this new international cycle. Adela, you have the floor. Well, first of all, and I think recalling what has been said in the panel, I think there should be a link between the different governmental institutions. These should be state matters so that policies can overcome time barrier. Going back to regulation, I believe that the key is to pay attention to those principles and standards that we would like to put in place in our regions. It's true that the best thing would be to have the best practices for digital economy. And we have challenges in terms of implementation. And it's important to understand the economic basis underlying these tasks. Though there are in some cases there are no regional standards, there are bilateral and multilateral agreements that deal with different aspects. I think Jose Juan was mentioning this, like for example, transboundary flow of data. This talks about the interjurisdictional nature and the transnational nature of Internet, and this is something we have to take into consideration when we want to regulate something and when we want to favor competition in our region. Regulatory frameworks based on principles that will maximize the benefits in terms of data export and data transfer. I think this can work. Like policies that can remove obstacles for trade and technical obstacles also, because the main challenge is how we can internationalize and digitalize the main productive sectors in the region. As some of my colleagues have said, there are certain productive sectors that are still to be digitalized, though they have great potentials. A recent study carried out in the Latin American Association for Internet shows that in Chile, for example, companies in online export to more than 28 markets, and this is something we have to maximize. We need flexible regulatory frameworks that take into account the best standards. I think this is the path forward when thinking how we regulate or deregulate some sectors in the digital world. Thank you. In this regard, I would like to ask Cristina, how do you see the new regulations in South America related to satellites? How do you approach this from the point of view of being satellites an important part of the ecosystem and having an effective regulation for proper performance? I believe that satellite is the most ignored element within Latin America. When we talk about broadband plan, we talk about optic fiber, and nobody takes into consideration the satellites. And when we talk about any type of communication, we don't take into consideration the satellite. And Latin America has several remote areas, or sometimes the geography is very complicated and you cannot, or the optic fiber does not reach these areas, or you cannot build mobile stations because there is or the size of the population is very small. In that sense, I would like to give you an example of how we could help reducing the digital divide in Latin America. The digital agenda in Europe has established that 100% coverage of the population is required for the year 2020. So public administrations have made an analysis of the penetration of both optic fiber and LTE, and they have seen that despite in Europe there is a lot of optic fiber deployment due to different characteristics, geographical or demographic. They know that there are some areas where LTE and optic fiber will not reach for the year 2020. So if they want to attain the goal, they are thinking to use satellites as a means to reach these areas. So what are they doing? Well, in countries like the United Kingdom, France, and some 2 months ago, Spain, there is deployment-assisted model that takes into consideration the characteristics of the different sites. If it has less than 500 inhabitants, or if it is possible to have internet, high-quality internet. So these places can opt for or can have as an option this model. I think this will help to reduce the digital divide. We need to have the widest knowledge possible as to the contribution of satellite to communication, and I think it is important to promote this type of knowledge for or among the different administrations. As to the regulation as such, we believe that satellite operators face several barriers. In Latin America, there is no open sky line to authorize satellite capacity. The policy varies from country to country. In the Andean Community of Nations, for example, requires prior authorization from the community, and they demand each member to have this authorization. And once you have that authorization, you have to go back and ask for a permit. So I think that we have to regulate when necessary, but we need to be flexible in terms of communications in general when it is possible. Thank you. We remind the audience or public that you can upload questions with Slido. You can upload your comments or doubts or questions regarding the debate. Cristina has brought a very important topic to the table, and it is that in this digital revolution, nobody can be left behind. What would be the role of private investment for reducing the digital divide? How can we promote private and public partnership? The income of a poor household is important. What can we do to achieve full inclusion? In this regard, I would maybe have somehow disruptive concept, but I am concerned because I believe that all of us agree on what has to be done, how to do it. However, we are far away from being understood once we go back to our countries and we tell them what we have discussed here and agreed. So in this regard, I believe that I don't know how, Pablo, but I think we need a document like this one, where we address digitalization, participation of governments, networks, the organization of all these ecosystems, so that we can have a document, so that they see that people that gather here, that came from different places, have reached these conclusions and agreement, and that document can include even disruptive issues. Doesn't matter if they say these people are crazy, this cannot be done like this, but maybe this is a way of sensitizing the governments that a big wave is coming our way and we have to do something. So it's not necessarily, I mean, we do not have to go into details, but it has been demonstrated that there is no leap over or forward, with all these obstacles. We are at the brink of digitalization, the Internet of Things, that will bring about huge economic and social changes, and we are not doing, or we're not foreseeing this. My comment on financing is that a disruptive position would be we have to give the same hierarchy at the government and budget level. We need the same hierarchy for the resources to develop a digital infrastructure, with the same level of concern as the resources we provide for education, justice, health, and the physical infrastructure of roads and bridges. You were saying that this governance structure could be the establishment of a ministry for digital infrastructure that would include all these topics with wide participation, considering that the regulations, of course, I do agree, we have to review regulations that are hindering development. I think this would have to include all those affected. We cannot develop the Internet of Things if we do not think about the regulations on health, regulations of banking systems. And all this requires resources, and in this regard I believe that in terms of budget, one way or the other we must strive to get a higher share of the budget for developing the digital infrastructures in our countries, and this is urgent. Thank you. Jose Juan, you have the floor. I believe that hell is full of good intentions. There is a very essential data, and Raul that knows more than that can correct me if I'm wrong. 95% of investment in telecommunications in Latin America comes from the private sector. This is a central aspect. It's not that we are trying to go back to a scheme based on public investment. What we are saying here is that our biggest challenge is to release private capital that today is captured through taxes or through a regulatory system and assigned or allotted to uses that are not so important from a social point of view. The good news is that we do not need public budget for areas where we can develop competition. This has been the best news in Latin America in the last 30 years. We have to be convinced that we have done the things correctly when we decided this. Not everybody has followed the same recipe, but the general rule has been this one, and this has generated competition, it has generated innovation, it has generated growth in terms of investment, and that is very good news. So maybe the first part of the recipe is to try to release more capital from private sources to meet our goals. Now, in terms of optimism, I would like to stress that from ASIET and from GSMA, they do their task well, but this year we will have 3 election processes. In November last year, we had the Chilean process also. So we have had elections in Chile, we have elections in Colombia now, Mexico, and Brazil at the end of the year. So we discovered that we had an opportunity, the opportunity of approaching presidential candidates and talk about this problem. Not about telecommunications, not about digital connectivity, but about digitalization of our countries. And I think there has been a very good reception. The documents prepared by GSMA and the document being presented by ASIET today are good documents with proposals that are more or less in the same line with what we are talking today. And I think that if we continue doing what we have done, that is to have a public-private dialogue with the presidential candidates, explain why this is necessary, I think this will not guarantee success, but I think it will be a very important step. And I think that what we should do with Pablo, with Sebastián, with ECLAC, with CAF, with all the regional stakeholders is to sell this idea. We need to create illusion with digital transformation. I think we are going well, or we are doing well so far. I comment. Pablo, Verena, Raúl. That will be the order. I think I was misunderstood. I'm not talking about public investment. I'm talking about allotting public resources for developing digital infrastructure through the whatever mechanisms. Yes. I just wanted to add something to this debate. One thing is the need for investment and for infrastructure, a pro-investment agenda which I believe is central and has a lot to do with regulatory processes, but then we have the demand perspective. And this has to do with one of the main reasons of the digital divide, and that is poverty. Socioeconomic restrictions that most of the Latin American population bear. The Latin American continent is the most unequal continent in the world, and beyond efforts to reduce prices, to expand coverage, there is still a barrier. We were working with Raúl in a very interesting study on how to reach the basis of the pyramid, and we have to think in more creative solutions where regulatory flexibility can support and complementary mechanisms between the public and the private so that we can get that inclusion. I think we should also talk about poverty. And how do we address the digitalization challenge from the viewpoint of the poor families or households in Latin America? I think that should be a fundamental part of our public policies.
From our side, we have been watching communication markets for over 30 years. And while it's different to say, okay, this is one model that works, because, you know, if I now mention one example, you'll say, yeah, but this works in one country but not in the other. There has been a consensus in many countries. So if you think back, right, over 20 years ago, we had a liberalization of many telecommunication markets. What did this liberalization bring? First of all, it brought the capacity of different operators to compete. So it brought competition. And second, the combination of this together with the creation of regulators meant that basically that companies, that generated revenues from their business, they were able to invest them in their networks. They were growing their networks, and that's something we were seeing, and it's still ongoing. So for us, the best model really is end-to-end competition, where you have different players in the market that compete against each other and that reinvest their capital. And really, we think that the heavy lifting, and that was also mentioned by Telefonica, should be done by the private sector, really, and the private sector knows how to do this because they have been doing it for some years and they are very successful in doing so. We also acknowledge that where the private sector cannot reach, really, if you're talking about really rural and remote areas, then we can think of some public-private partnership if there is clearly no other possibility. I said I won't mention examples, but I would still like to mention one, because Pablo, you mentioned poverty. I would like to mention the Indian example, and for those that have already heard it, my apologies. What we saw in India is, India is a big country. It's a country where you have a quite significant share of poor people. We saw a new operator coming in, purely privately financed. This was in 2016. It's Reliance Industries, and the brand is called Jio. So Jio, what they did is they deployed a 4G-only network across the country. So 4G only means people need a smartphone, right? So they had to find a way to provide very cheap phones to people. So, and they managed to deploy, and this was pure private investment, their network quite quickly, which meant that from 2016 to now to 2018, they acquired 170 million customers, right? Never seen. How do they do that? They don't say, okay, I look at the GDP of the overall market and that's what I offer. They have very specific offers and targeted offers. So they have offers for poor people, very small cards. You can buy a card for a day, a couple of hours, and it's actually affordable. And they brought the prices in the Indian market down. And this is how they reach inclusion. They are now close to a coverage of 99% of the entire country. On the other end, they also provide packages for people that really, are high data users like gamers. And we see that, the overall traffic of the network compares to one of the leading OECD countries, which is Finland. So for us, really, competition is key. Fostering competition in the market will drive investment. And Latin America is, fighting with other countries. So the money will go where operators need to invest. So if you have a market where you don't have competition, the operators don't need to do much. If there are other parts of the world where the operators face severe competition, that's what we see. They need to do something, they need to act, they need to deploy fiber networks. So fostering competition for us is key.
I think that also another element, I totally agree with what Verena said, is to have appropriate incentives also on the fiscal side, for example. So not necessarily subsidies, but of course I think some subsidies sometimes are necessary, but at the same time there are other kind of incentives that can be used, like demand-side subsidies, for example, that have been particularly powerful for the expansion of broadband use and so on. So I think, of course, competition is key to keep, let's say, prices down.
I would like to add something that I think we have not dwelled on it. A project I did that was financed by the European Union about the amount of public investment in scholarships and incentives in I+D in Latin America. I took the biggest countries and the figure was $20 billion for innovation and research in the digital sector. We still don't see the results. That is the first example. Second example was, a clerk was telling me, what is the problem with human capital in Latin America? The problem is that we don't have much training courses, or the problem is that young people don't want to go to technological universities. We made an analysis. There was a gap in terms of PhDs, but in terms of graduate courses, there was availability. Now, third example, developing a digital agenda for our country, we had to analyze what were the public programs that the country was developing. We had 374 initiatives at the national and provincial level, only 5 in the case of schools, and there was a huge discoordination. There was no coordination, and so economists have here a classic case of communication failure. So if we can have a rational mechanism to see how this public money is being spent, we can change the situation. We should use those $20 billion in a more rational manner. Why should we compete among countries? We can tell Uruguay to focus on agriculture and tea. We can tell Brazilians that to focus on e-commerce. We can tell the Argentinians to focus on financial services. So let's distribute responsibilities. Let us coordinate. Instead of having 5 programs in one country, why don't we have only one and we rationalize? What about the universal service funds? If we only have the private sector, that will not be enough. We have to recognize that the public sector is sometimes inefficient, and we have to do something about this. A last comment talking about the supply and demand. Another thing we see in many countries where we work is that many people do not understand why internet is important for their lives. So creating relevant spaces is important. And I don't know if any of you have worked with this, but I'm very much concerned with the education of children. People are learning that it's not enough to teach to write in a computer or to devise software. We have to develop other skills like empathy, and we have to be open to different models, learning models. And I think this is essential. There are many foundations today that focus on this when they think about local innovators. And from the supply side, I think we have to offer better products at lower prices. So I think that if we think about a digital ecosystem, Facebook, together with other partners, founded the Telecom Info Project. More than 500 companies are part of this. And this is for improving the value chain of engineering companies and reduce the cost in terms of inefficiency. And this will improve costs and profit margins.
Hola. Hace 40 años en
40 years ago in Argentina, when the public company providing services did not reach a specific community, those communities started to organize in cooperatives, a figure in which they gave services among each other, and they created telephonic cooperatives. That was 40 years ago. It's a pity we don't have Sebastián or Puerta here, because on Monday we were talking about the broadband in rural areas, and they're working in community networks models. So if we are talking about connecting those who are not connected, I clothes, and this is a compliment to everything that have been done. I propose to talk to governments to extend this public-private association, but also to take care of those places where this phenomenon is taking place, is occurring, and they don't need eventually to have the operator or to have the government. They organize themselves, they exchange services. I cannot attest any of those, but Sebastián de la Gamba knows about that, and he's supporting those movements. And I guess it's useful, it's worthwhile to support these kind of movements and to get closer to those communities that have not received the services yet. And it's a way we have to take so we can connect those who are not connected. Has been quite enriching this debate. Unfortunately, time is up. I'm wrapping up. I would like to say that we have been debated about the need we have of political and multi-sector leadership with a vision and a comprehensive agenda, multi-platform, that we are to foster and to complete from the places where we are, taking advantage of the change of authorities and producing public and private dialogue in the short term to make progresses. The agendas might prevail on time and to be leveraged on solid and technically solid events with flexible juridical contexts. Not regulating is also regulating, and this is an idea we have to take with us. The main regulatory problem for the infrastructure developers is the fiscal problem. We need to create a healthy investment context with equal competition for everyone. In this digital revolution, we cannot leave anyone behind. There is an element related to poverty we cannot ignore, and we need to face that with the right incentives. We have to coordinate and focalize these issues, eliminating inefficiencies. We need to counter Latin America with a sense of emergency or urgency from the radio spectrum and the education for the coming 20 years in this new digital economy. Thank you all for the participation. Thanks for the debate. We would like to thank the public as well. We would like to make this closing, and we would like to thank as well for being here. And we want to thank the government of Cuba. We want to thank Texas for hosting us in this paradox.
Buenas tardes. Queríamos invitar.
Good afternoon. Just wanted to invite
Queríamos invitarlos a todos.
We would like to invite you all to the closing cocktail that is going to be hosted by Huawei, and to remind you it's going to be in the beach. Casual, very casual clothes, since we are to be in the sand of the beach. Please consider that.